I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's meeting. My name is Julie Fain. I work at Haymarket Books, one of the sponsors tonight, and we're really excited to be able to present this program tonight. This is a duo of Haymarket authors. If you picked up one of our new catalogs on your way in, you'll see both Anthony Arnove and Rick Wolff are well represented in our catalog. Rick's book will be coming out from Haymarket this fall. And we're also very grateful to Lannan Foundation for helping us to put on this event tonight. Their help has really been invaluable in this series of events that we've done over time in Chicago. We hope there will be more. We do encourage anybody who's interested in finding out about more. There's going to be a sign-up sheet to give us your email and your address. We do want to continue to have these kinds of conversations here in Chicago. I think they're sorely needed. Do pick up our catalog, pick up Rick's book. You'll see that we have copies of his latest book, Capitalism Hits the Fan, outside, along with a number of other books from Haymarket that are really relevant to the topic tonight. Before I turn it over to Anthony and Rick both, I just wanted to remind people, it's sort of obligatory to turn off or down your cell phone. So tonight, Anthony is going to give Rick a quick introduction. Then Rick's going to give us maybe 40 minutes talking. It's up to him to decide how long he wants to go. And then Anthony and Rick can have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to you all to ask questions, comments, anything from the floor. So we will have a chance for that at the end, so hold on to your questions. Anthony, just to let people know, is an editor at Haymarket. He is the author. The forthcoming book he has from Haymarket is a collection of never-before-published speeches by Howard Zinn, and that will be coming out in the fall. Anthony also co-produced and co-authored a book with Howard, Voices of a People's History of the United States. So I will hand it over to Anthony. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Rick. I had the great honor of doing an event in Santa Fe a couple of months ago with Rick, sponsored by Lannan Foundation. It's great to be here and able to do this event tonight in Chicago, thanks to the support of Lannan Foundation. Rick is an economist and a truth teller, and those are two things that almost never go together in the same sentence in any age, especially our own today. Most economists are what Karl Marx described in his day as the hired prize fighters for the ruling class. Their function is first to shore up ideas that will make the existing order seem natural, unalterable, no matter what the cost is for working people, for the environment, for the dispossessed, for the poor. Ideas such as the natural rate of unemployment, which you will hear discussed in economics classes and economics discussions, as if there was anything the least bit natural about unemployment. They are like Dr. Pangloss and Voltaire's Candide, assuring us that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Their next function is to make economics seem as if it's a special preserve of experts, of Ivy League educated PhDs, and only if you've studied economics in an elite university can you possibly understand the way the economy works, so alone be part of discussions about how we might better organize economics and the society and construct a better economic system that meets human needs rather than leaving the vast majority of us behind, as capitalism does. But Rick Wolff cuts through all of this cant. In his columns for truthout.org, his posts on his excellent website, which I encourage you all to bookmark, which is rdwolff.com, in his talks, as you'll see tonight, in his online classes and his classes at the Brecht Forum in New York, for those of you who might have the opportunity to come and take any of those, in his radio program on Pacifica Radio, which is called Economic Update, which you can hear on WBAI. You can also hear online, podcast. There's links from Rick's website. in his teaching, in his academic work, and in his latest book, Capitalism Hits the Fan, which I can't encourage you strongly enough to buy. Rick lays out in plain terms how the economy really works, and he does so not as an objective, disinterested enterprise, but he does so with the aim of empowering us to intervene, to understand the economy better in order to change it. He explains how the economy doesn't work for most people, how crisis is built into the system, how capitalism is threatening the survival of the planet through its relentless focus on short-term profit at the expense of any considerations of environmental sustainability, how exploitation and greed are not a rational basis for organizing our lives, and how through our own struggle we can create a truly democratic, humane, cooperative alternative. And that is the subject of the forthcoming book he is working on now for Haymarket Books called Democracy at Work, in which I hope all of you will have an opportunity to hear him discuss further and will be able to read when Haymarket publishes it in the fall. Rick Wolff uses words not to obscure, but to illuminate. And in helping us to understand the economy, he helps us better understand how we can shape and how we can change it. Please help me in welcoming Rick Wolff.
Okay, can you all hear me pretty well? Okay, if at any point this becomes incomprehensible, say something, do something. Don't stand on ceremony. I want to thank Haymarket for bringing me here and the Lannan Foundation as well. It was very kind of them. I really enjoy doing this sort of thing, so it's a pleasure for me to have an audience here in Chicago. I'm not here that often, and so it's something I looked forward to and planned. I'll try to live up to the kind words that Anthony said, but if I don't, remember, he said them. I didn't. I am an economist. I do apologize. We economists, in addition to everything Anthony said, which was spot on, exactly right, there's one other way to understand what we do. We learned a lesson years ago from lawyers. Lawyers understand that the world is full of complications and struggles between people that are pretty straightforward. You're not paying me what you owe me, you are not doing what you're supposed to do, and the lawyers understood that if we kept everything at the level that was clearly understandable, we wouldn't need lawyers. So they began by translating fairly straightforward things into incomprehensible language, and then were able to come back to us as we tried to struggle with our problems and explain to us that we needed the law, and that meant we needed them to translate that language they had invented back into the simplicities with which we all began. That's what economists mostly do. Very simple ideas, translate them into incomprehensible language, because then you have to pay us to translate it back so that you can understand it. And I'm going to try to jump over all of that by making it fairly straightforward. And I'm going to be very ambitious. Again, I'm going to blame Anthony for that. He invited me to be ambitious, so I'm going to be ambitious. I'm going to try to talk about what the problem in our economy is, what solutions have been tried that haven't quite succeeded, to be kind, and what an alternative solution might look like, in the hopes, as Anthony quite rightly said, that I can persuade at least some of you to move in that direction, at least to think about it. And maybe even beyond thinking about it, do something about it. All right, so first the problem. The way I want to get at the problem is to talk about a taboo here in the United States. Not the one you might have thought about, not the taboo we've long had on dealing with matters of, I don't know, sex, for example. I hope that would get your attention. We have another taboo that I want to talk to you about, and that's a taboo about our economic system. For 50 years, roughly, half a century now, it has been impossible in the United States to seriously debate, criticize our economic system. We have great debates about our political system. We have great debates about our educational system. A couple years ago, we had a big debate about our national health system, and we're having it again because the Supreme Court is working on it right now, making a decision. So we talk about our health system and our this system, but one thing we do not discuss is the economic system. You cannot criticize it. You cannot have a debate about it. The different points of view represent different ways of cheerleading for it. Strange and very dangerous. Because if you have a system that is exempted from criticism, about which you can talk about little details but never the system as a whole, then of course a system rots behind such a protective barrier of no debate. So in a sense, we shouldn't be so surprised that our system isn't working real well. We haven't paid a lot of attention to a serious analysis of it for half a century. Well, is the system working so well that it might make sense not to bother criticizing it? I don't think so. I'm going to give you just a couple of ways of understanding that. Our system is stupefyingly unstable. This is the second major breakdown of capitalism in 75 years. The last one was the 1930s. Between the end of the collapse of the 1930s, roughly 1940-41, and the beginning of the current disaster, 2007, the National Bureau of Economic Research counts 11 other economic downturns. 11 between the two monsters. And all of that in 75 years. In every one of those downturns, millions of people were thrown out of work. In every one of those downturns, vast amounts of product that could have transformed poor people's lives into decent lives were never produced because we allowed millions of people to sit side by side with huge portions of our productive capacity sitting idle, gathering rust and dust, rather than producing anything. Not only did we do that, but we didn't handle that problem very well. For example, we didn't say, well, if there's going to be unemployment, let everybody have a few hours less a week of work. No, no, no. We piled all the unemployment on some people. Other people had overtime. What a mess. Every few years. For those of you who've heard this joke, I'm going to say it anyway. If you lived with a person as unstable as this economic system, you would have moved out long ago. But you live with this as if you have to, as if you had no choice. But you do. Why did those ups and downs, why did that instability happen? Well, here's an interesting thing. You know, instability exists before capitalism. In ancient societies, there were instabilities. But they usually were associated with something we can point to. Nature, a drought, a flood, too much heat, too little heat, soil fertility disasters, illnesses. We understood economics went up and down because nature is nature. And sometimes it wasn't nature, it was human problems. Wars were a big one, produced ups and downs in economy. But there's no way to explain the last 75 years of chaotic instability of our society in terms of nature. There's no correlation there. Economists are very excited about correlation. No correlation there. No correlation with war. There really is only one conclusion. It's built into the system that it's unstable. So if you have an unstable system where the problem is in the system, but you have a society with a taboo on discussing the system, you've got a very bad combination. A society with real problems that cannot deal with them. And when you have that, as you have it in personal problems, a serious problem that you can't deal with, it usually makes your life worse. And so it is with capitalism. Let's see how that works. We have a big crisis now. Let's see what happens. Can we discuss it as a systemic problem? No. So what do we have instead? We have what I would call scapegoating. If you're a right-winger, you're angry at the government. This is a right-wing obsession, as you know. Anything goes wrong, it's the government. It's a wonderful arrangement for big business. Wonderful. Over the last 5 years of crisis, for example, The overwhelming majority of people who've been fired from their job have been fired by a private capitalist employer. And the overwhelming majority of people who've been thrown out of their home by foreclosure had the foreclosure process begun by a private capitalist bank. And who are the people angry at? The government. They leap right over the people who actually screwed them to blame someone else. If I were a corporate executive or a banker, I'd be very pleased with a system like this. I kick you, you get angry at somebody else. I kick you again, you get me more angry at them. This is wonderful. Why should I ever stop kicking you? So we have scapegoats, and the right wing is angry at the government. The right wing is angry at other scapegoats, too. The poor people, those people who took out the subprime mortgages that didn't have the money to pay for. It's those poor people. Or maybe it's immigrants, or foreigners, or terrorists, or Muslims, or who knows. Scapegoats. And the left, not to be outdone, no better able to understand system despite what it says, has its scapegoats. The bankers, the Federal Reserve, the big businessmen, or the government, ever there, only now in reverse. The government didn't regulate enough. The government didn't do enough. It's the whoa, everything else other than an analysis of the system. The problem is the system, the way we relate to one another in producing goods and services, in distributing them, in parceling out the income that our output enables us to have. Oh, no, no. We're not going to look at all those relationships. Taboo. We look for scapegoats. And it shows up not only in the way we think, looking for who the bad guys are, right-wing bad guys, left-wing bad guys. We beat each other up over who the real bad guy is. Left-wing newspapers say it's not the poor people. Right-wing newspapers say it is the poor people. And then we have long debates about whether it is or it isn't the poor people. This is bizarre. And it shows up in practice, too. No one kind of understands that it's a systemic problem. So when the government says, okay, we're going to bail out all the banks, okay. And we're going to stimulate the economy, okay. And we're going to help some poor people and unemployed, okay. Why not? It sort of helps. And if there's no systemic critique, then there needs to be no systemic response. Nobody is going to say, change the system, because that's a taboo. That's off the table. Can't be thought. That's the problem. The problem is an unstable capitalism. I'm not going to regale you, because I'm sure you don't need it, with all of the disasters that flow from an economic system that's so unstable. I read today in the newspaper on the way here about how the population growth rate has collapsed over the last 5 years. We're now seeing rates of people having children that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Hint. Same issue. Literally, we're not having children, which, by the way, for the future of the American economy is not good. Not good. Very serious. Mental illness, off the chart. Alcoholism, off the chart. Breakup of relationships, off the chart. More people are unmarried today, adults, than are married. First time, I think, in our history. Though the signs and the costs of this will last for decades. Solutions. Let's talk about what solutions have been tried. The first one, and bear with me for a few minutes if I do some American history that some of you know and all of you should know, but my experience in audiences is that you don't know, and I'm not going to embarrass anyone by asking you to raise your hand if you knew what I was about to say. Okay? What happened in the last time we were in a crisis like this was a kind of solution. Here's what it was. We had this bizarre crash in 1929, and the economy really sank like a stone. By 1933, the unemployment rate officially 25%, 3 times what it is today. Had a president, a Democrat, replacing a Republican. Sound familiar? The Democrat was a centrist. Sound familiar? Came in on a balanced budget idea. Should sound real familiar. Name Roosevelt. But there was a difference. It was a much worse depression than this one, at least than this one is so far. But that wasn't the key difference. Here's the key difference. The mass of people had organizations who were leftist and were willing at least to raise the question of a system. Not all of them, and not very strongly, but some. Let's go through what they were, because you should be stunned by their absence today and the meaning of it. First, CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, unionized, brought into American trade unions millions of workers in the depth of a depression. It was the greatest union organizing drive in the history of the United States. We never had anything like it before. We've never had anything like it again. Amazing. Unions confronted capital. Workers organized. Second, we had a half a dozen socialist parties, and they were strong. They had lots of members, and they were heavily interwoven with the CIO. And third, a powerful communist party. Wow. Unions, socialists, communists, lots of them, well organized and interacting with one another to give each other the spice of their particular perspectives. All of that's missing now, but it was present then. And here's an interesting consequence of what happened then that was a bit of a solution. Here's what it was. And again, to remind you, for those of you that don't know, depth of a depression, 3 times worse than today. So you can imagine that the government then, federal, state, local, was like today, impoverished. Unemployed people can't pay income tax. They're not earning anything. Unemployed people and their families can't buy things, so they don't pay a sales tax. Wherever you look, the revenue coming to the state, local, and federal governments was shrinking. We can't do anything. We can't keep the library open. We can't. Just like today. But there were those 3 organizations, the unions, the socialists, and the communists. And they began to say to the mass of people with a profound response, I'm going to use language freely now, this system sucks. Okay, this is not working real well. That's why you are so poor. That's why your prospects are even worse. And your children, forget about it. And this frightened the people at the top, starting with Mr. Roosevelt, because they were organized and they were talking this stuff about the system. I mean, they were mainly concerned about getting food and shelter, but they were talking about the system. So Roosevelt did a remarkable thing. He went to his friends and associates. Roosevelt, as you know, comes from a very good family. He had ancestors who were presidents before him. So he knew all the heads of corporations and the rich people. He was one of them. They intermarry a lot. Then and now. And he said to them something stark. Basically, he said to his corporate friends and his rich people friends, I want you to give me a lot of your money, like a real lot of it. And I'm going to do things that are going to save you. I'm going to take the money, I'm going to give it to all those poor people that you have been screwing by throwing them out of work. And they all looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. And then he explained, you better give me the money, because if you don't, those union people and the socialists and communists, they're going to come down the road and they're going to cut you a much worse deal. Half of them agreed with Mr. Roosevelt because they saw the people in the streets. They saw. Half of them never agreed with him. I'm going to come back to them in a minute. But half of them agreed. And with half of them, Roosevelt had what it took to go to the unions and the socialists and the communists and he'd say, I'm going to do things for you you never dreamed of on one condition. Stop talking about the system. Let it be. And the unions and the socialists and the communists, with some exceptions, agreed. a deal was done. And Mr. Roosevelt could then go on the radio and do some extraordinary things in the depths of the Depression. Number one, he created the Social Security system. In the middle of a Great Depression, when there was absolutely no money to do anything, he announced to every old person over 65, hello, this is the government, we're going to give you money for the rest of your life every month. I thought there was no money. Oh, there was money. As soon as that was done, he went on the radio again, and he said, I got another plan. It's called unemployment insurance. I'm going to go to the millions and millions of unemployed people, and I'm going to give you money every week for years. Whoa. And then, not to be outdone, because those were the two small programs, he went on the radio and he said, if the private sector either cannot or will not provide work, there's no alternative but for me to do it. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 12.5 million jobs. What do you mean there's no money? He knew where the money was, and that's exactly where the money is now. Do we have to have an austerity program here? Let's review. Depression is 3 times worse in the 30s. We create Social Security. 1/3 the Depression now, and the Republicans and Democrats are in Washington trying to figure out how to cut Social Security. What starker opposition could you imagine? That was thought to be a solution. Notice a solution that never questioned the system. And by not doing so, as I'm going to show you now, they destroyed themselves. Remember the half of the rich people and corporations Roosevelt did not convince. They went to work from the day those things were passed, Social Security, unemployment insurance, public jobs, to undo all of that. You know, for a large corporation, this whole thing was a problem. By the way, I can see from some of your faces, how did he get the money from the people? Let me make sure you all understand that. And let me give you the most dramatic moment of it all. The most dramatic moment happens in 1942. You remember those as years of war. Much more interesting was what happened in Congress. In 1942, President Roosevelt sent a message to Congress proposing new legislation. And the proposal he made was the following. I want to propose a new top income tax rate for the richest Americans, for everyone earning over $25,000 a year. The proposed tax rate was 100%. Let me make sure you understand what I just said. If you earn more than $25,000 a year in 1942, you will not earn more than $25,000 a year, because every dollar over $25,000 you get, you're going to have to send to Washington, or else you go to jail. That was the proposal of the president. The Republican Party, then as now, went ballistic. That's a normal condition for them. And they went ballistic, and they got half the Democrats to go along with them. That's another normal condition. And they forced a compromise on the president. He didn't get 100%. He got 94%. Every dollar over $25,000 that you earned in 1942, you gave 94 cents to Washington. You got to keep 6. I didn't make this up. I wouldn't have had the imagination. That's how it was paid for. He taxed the rich, big time. Let me give you the other dimension. Same year, 1942-43. The federal government in this country relies on income taxes. That's how it gets the overwhelming bulk of its money. Taxes the income of individuals, and it taxes the income of businesses. In 1943, for every dollar that was taxed from individuals, $1.50 was raised by taxing profits of enterprise. What is the relationship today? For every dollar of tax the government gets from individuals, corporations are required to pay 25 cents. The top income tax bracket in the middle 40s, 94%. What is the top income tax bracket today? 35%. Do you understand? The rich paid for the kind of solution Roosevelt was able to produce. And then they went to work to undo it, which is why the numbers look the way I just described them to you. And how did that work? Simple. For corporations, high taxes are a problem to get around. Government regulation is a problem to get around. Taxes on rich executives is a problem to get around. They want to overcome those problems. That's what they learn in business school, is your job. Go and find the problems and fix them. So they did. And how were they able to do that? They realized that the taxes are determined by the politicians. You give them enough time, these corporate people, they figure it out. They're slow, but they get there. So they needed to control the political arrangement. But the need to do it and the desire to do it are not enough. You have to have the resources to do it. And here's the punchline. Nothing that ever happened in the Great Depression took the resources away from the people who dispose of them. And who are they? The major shareholders and the boards of directors. Roosevelt never changed that. And the deal he struck with the communists, socialists, and unionists didn't require it. So the corporate sector took the incentive to undo the New Deal, took the resources that they still gathered into their hands because they're the ones who get the profits that labor produces, and they used the profits to undo the New Deal, which was the problem that they faced. The last capstone was a law, a regulation passed in the depths of the Depression called the Banking Act, 1933. It prohibited banks from using the deposits that individuals and companies put in them to make risky investments. Oh, I know, I'm an economist. We teach that that's what banks do. They are the prudent lenders whom we give our trust to. That's why they're called trust companies. Trust to, so that they take the deposits and act as our agent. And if you believe that, I will sell you several bridges that cross the East River in New York for a very good price. Anyway, they had really done such a miserable job that the Congress passed a law which said you cannot be a depository institution, you cannot receive deposits and make risky investments. You have to separate a commercial bank from an investment bank, it's called. And they went to work to undo that. And in the 1990s, they finally succeeded. It took them a while to get those politicians, whom they have been increasingly buying, to repeal that bill. And one day in 1999, with great fanfare, the bill that repealed that act was taken to the President of the United States, and with that wonderful smile he has, Bill Clinton signed it. 8 years later, the banks collapsed for the same reason. Well, we laugh, but we are the victims of this lunacy. We didn't change the system. We left the corporations just the way they were. The mass of people come in and do the work. The board of directors collects the surplus or the profit, and then together with the major shareholders, they decide what to do. That's how we run the system, and we're surprised when they run it in a way that they have always run it, because this instability of capitalism is built into that system. What's the point of mobilizing millions of people to get a tax change or to get a regulation if you leave intact the system that you know will undo it? The only difference if we react to this crisis with new regulations and new taxes, which is what the left in America, such as it is, proposes most of the time, the only difference will be after half a century of practice, the corporations will be much quicker in getting rid of them than they were last time. I'm serious. What then is, yes, thank you. What then is a solution? Well, I'm not going to propose to you a solution that's a good idea. I mean, I have good ideas, I think, and I could do that, but I don't want to waste your time. I'm going to propose to you a solution which comes out of this history as the only way to go, at least the only way that I can think of. But before I do it, I want to talk to you about another solution that didn't work out. More controversial, but I want to put it on the table. There is classical socialism and classical communism, societies that went in a different direction. Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, and so on. What about them? What did they do? They did two very interesting things. One, they took the property away from private owners, and they socialized or nationalized it. And the second thing they did was they suppressed markets and put above the market the planning of what was to be done. How do you mix resources with people to produce outputs? But the interesting thing is that they didn't change the relationship in the production unit, did they? They got rid of the private capitalist board of directors. Unlike our system, it isn't a handful of major shareholders that select who the board of directors is. Board of directors typically 15 people. Major shareholders, another 15 people. They make all decisions. That's how private capitalism works. They didn't do that. But when they changed to socialism in 1917 in Russia, in 1949 in China, and so on, here's what they did. They said, no more private owners. The state, in the name of the whole people, will be the owner. Interesting. And we're going to have planning. Interesting. But we are not going to say to each enterprise, to each workplace, the workers there are in fact now going to become also the decision makers, that they didn't do. In Russia, for example, they had something called the Council of Ministers, a state official group that got into their hands the profits, the way boards of directors do. Interesting. They too didn't change the system, not in terms of the relationships of production, not in the not at work, not in production, not in the production and distribution of the surplus, which, for those of you who study Marx, is what capital is all about. Interesting. And what happened to that solution? Gee, about the same thing that happened to Roosevelt's solution. It got undone over the last 40 years. So that in those countries, increasingly, the socialized property has gone back to the private, and the planning has given way to the market. Just like the Social Security system is being cut, and not only don't we have a federal employment program, we live in a society that doesn't even discuss it. Amazing. What then is the conclusion that I draw from all of this? I think it's the only one that flows out of this. Here's the problem. You cannot continue to leave the decisions about what is done in the enterprise to the people who now make it. They have shown us what they will do. They periodically spin out of control with speculations that collapse the system. If you impose rules, regulations, and taxes on them to try to make them pay, they use their wealth to undo them. Okay, then the inference we would have to draw would run like this. Deprive them of the opportunity to do this again, because having shown us that they're going to do it, it becomes our mistake if we run this game again. How would you do that? Well, it's not complicated. We change the organization of production. The workers, the majority, who do the work, enterprise by enterprise, have to become their own board of directors. No more private ownership, no more stock market, no more major shareholder, no more major shareholders electing a board of directors. That's over. Thank you very much. It's been a nice couple of centuries. Goodbye. Here's a new arrangement. Monday to Thursday, you come to work and you do your particular function in the enterprise. On Friday, you come to work. Maybe it's one of those dress-down Fridays, and you can wear sloppy overalls and a funny hat and bring a Frisbee and be high as a kite, or whatever it is you do for enjoyment. And you sit around all day and you have meetings in which you decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. You are your own board of directors. Now let's very quickly, and this is my conclusion, talk about what that might work like, what it might look like. Because I want you to think about it. Not only because it's a good idea, but because it comes out of our history. If we don't do this, we are condemning ourselves, our fellow citizens, and our children to this same boring and destructive rehash of a system that is chronically unstable. But let's go. First, if the mass of workers are making the decisions, they are not going to be using their profits to undo the kinds of social legislation that a president like Roosevelt did, because they're the beneficiaries of it. So they're not going to go to work using the profits of enterprise to undo it. That would make no sense. They're the ones that are benefiting by all of this, by a governmental pension system, by an unemployment insurance system, by the government as an employer of last resort so that nobody has to worry about a job. These are things they'll all understand. They'll all support. How do we know that? Because they always have. That's not a hard one to figure out. Next, some that are a bit more fun. Let's think about what the workers would do if they're the ones who make the decisions. What do you think would be the likelihood they'd move the plant to China? No, I'm very serious. Are they going to do this? No. They're not going to destroy their lives, lose their jobs, disrupt their families, destroy the community. They're not going to, I don't know, make a Detroit. They're not going to do it. For very obvious reasons. Why should they? Why should they do this? They won't do it. The pattern of where production is located would be completely revolutionized, and a whole new system of making these decisions would have to be developed, because you're not going to have a company say, well, we'll make more money by producing in Shanghai than producing in Cincinnati. Goodbye, Cincinnati. Drop dead. We're going to Shanghai. That's not going to happen. Oh, this is getting more interesting. Would you think the workers would decide, if they were the 10,000 workers in a plant or 200 of whatever it is, to pay some of themselves huge salaries, 200, 300, 400 times the amount of the others? Likely to happen? I don't think so. Real unlikely. We're not going to have the distribution of income problems in such a society that we have here, or at least it's a lot less likely. Hey, this is getting interesting. Let's continue. Would we be likely to see these workers put into effect a really toxic technology because it was more profitable? I don't know. You know, their children are about, 3 blocks away. Their mother is within an hour. I don't think so. They're going to be much more concerned about the toxicity of their technology than we're used to, because they have to live with it, rather than having a board of directors 5,000 miles away make a decision to move someplace else. They won't live anywhere near there. Their gated community has huge fans that blow that air back into the city. In the 1970s, after a century and a half, American real wages stopped rising. Some of you know this story because I tell it a lot. America's a special place. Wages rose for 150 years, stopped in the 1970s, and after that, wages were flat in America, real wages, the amount of money you actually get, adjusted for the prices you pay. Over the last 30 years, while the wages were flat, the productivity of American labor kept on rising. Workers became more productive with computers and education. So for 30 years, we've had a very bizarre situation in America. The wages are flat, but the productivity of the workers rises. Well, wages are kind of what the employer gives the worker, and productivity is what the worker gives the employer. So if what the wages are flat, that means what the employer gives the workers is the same, and what the workers gives the employer goes up. That explains the inequality of income and wealth in America. No mystery at all. And why did wages flatten out? Because the defining characteristic of the United States stopped in the 1970s. That defining characteristic, labor shortage. The Europeans who came here, how shall I say this politely, removed the local persons. We did a little ethnic cleansing of our own. And that meant in a very rich country, with wonderful oceans and harbors, where capital could be very productive, we kept having a shortage of people to work, which is why most of you, if you are an American, have ancestors who were immigrants, because that's the only way to solve the labor problem here, wave after wave of immigrants. And how do you get immigrants to come? You raise the wages. And once they're here on the coast, how do you prevent them from running interior to take the land taken away from the Indians? You keep raising the wages. Otherwise, you lose them. In the 1970s, it all ended. The computer replaced people. We didn't need people. American companies were moving abroad. We didn't need people. American women were coming into the labor force in massive numbers. They wanted jobs, and a new wave of immigrants came from Latin America. You put together the women and the immigrants looking for more jobs and fewer jobs available, and all employers had a wonderful opportunity of the last 30 years, no more need to raise wages. And as all employers learn early in their career at the business school, if you don't have to pay workers higher wages, don't do it. So they didn't. If workers had been in charge of America's enterprises and they were becoming more and more productive, would they have stopped raising their wages the way it had been done for 150 years? Not likely. And therefore, the gap between rich and poor in this country would never have developed to the extent that it exists now. Wow. Should I go on? I could. I'm enumerating a small portion of the benefits that would accrue. And here's perhaps the biggest one. Do you think if workers ran an enterprise, all the enterprises, if we had that arrangement, they would ever permit the following to exist? Millions of workers who want to work. Roughly 1/4 of our industrial capacity to produce idle. Those are the government numbers. Would it ever make sense if we need to rebuild our cities, if we need to help people who have poverty, both American and others? Would it ever make sense to do? No worker would countenance such a thing. That's crazy. That's irrational. And if you were worried about output, and you really think we don't need the extra output, good, then distribute all that free time across the population. Capitalism has for 200 years justified every technical advance, no matter how destructive it was of people's lives and jobs, on the grounds that we are saving labor. This is labor-saving technology. We're making the world an easier place to live in. Americans work more hours of paid labor today than at any time in the history of the country. The promise is a joke. It was never true. Do we have the physical capacity to do a lot less work and to have more leisure? Of course we do. The problem is the system. Profit is what drives it, not the logic of people's lives. You wouldn't have the irrationality. You wouldn't have the unemployment. If workers ran the enterprises, one of the first things they'd do is set up a system in which if the demand for whatever these workers are producing in a particular factory drops, then there's a system in place run by the government to provide training to move people to another job in the same location, in another location. Workers could choose who's the one would be willing to move with his or her family. All of this can be worked out. The problem isn't technical and the problem isn't intellectual. It's a problem of the political economic situation making these obvious solutions the ones that are chosen. And the reason we haven't chosen this solution, obvious as it is because of that taboo with which I began. You can't deal with this system. It's the unspeakable, the ungraspable. And the irony is, when Marx is writing in the 19th century, surrounded as he is by critics of this or that aspect of what was going on, he labored hard to realize, to work his way to saying it isn't the monetary system. He was critical of his fellow Proudhon, who was very wrapped up with money and how the money works. You know, kind of a Federal Reserve fetishist of his time. And Marx was critical of him. And then Marx was critical of a whole lot of other groups that he felt kinship with. They were radicals. They were critical of society, and he felt one of them. But he said they didn't get the system and its core in the production arrangements that people were involved in. Same lesson, I would argue, still needs to be learned and applied. Last point. I know for Americans particularly, it's hard to think about such a change. It seems too much to hope for, too utopian, who knows? I hope I've given you some reason to think we don't have any other option. It's actually the only practical way. If we don't do this, we're condemning ourselves to repeat what we just, if we work now to get not just the Dodd-Frank bill, but a better one, to raise taxes on the rich, which I go around the country arguing for. But if that's what we do without changing the system, I have two reactions. One, if we succeed, we will very soon see in our own slightly younger people a great rage at us for having deceived them. But I don't even think we'll get there. I think the mass of the American working class already gets this. And if we try to rally the mass of the American working people to a program of regulations and taxes the rich and so on, they're going to look at us, and in so many words, they're going to say to us, we've been there, we've done that, we're not going to do that again. You either come up with a better, bigger idea, or we're not going to get a workers' movement. We're just going to sit here and watch this crisis play itself out and hope that each of us can slither through with the least amount of suffering. But I know American audience. I've been born and lived all my life in the United States. So I know I need to finish by presenting this idea in a way that is more palatable. So I'm going to do that. For workers to take over the enterprises is simply the final, long overdue step in democracy as a concept, right? The idea of democracy is if you have to live with the decisions, then you must be able to participate in making them. We as a nation try to take seriously that idea. We want the political people who make decisions to be accountable. We choose them. We participate in making those decisions by deciding who's going to be in the position to do it. Well, if you're committed to democracy, let me point out something that's a little bizarre. Where do most people who are adults spend most of their waking hours? At work. 5 out of 7 days, that's a big proportion. 5 out of 7 days, you get up in the morning, brush your teeth, get all dressed up to go to work. And you stay at work all those best hours. And you come home and you're fit for beer, pizza, and TV. Right? We spend our time at work. If democracy is a basic value of the system, how came it to be that we exempted the place and the situation where we spend most of our lives? I mean, either it's your value or it isn't. If it's okay to go into a workplace where the mass of people do not participate in the decision what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits, then clearly that's the norm of a corporation in this country, then you are entering a non-democratic place when you go to work. But if you believe in democracy, whence did it come, this idea that it doesn't apply to your job? I can understand why a corporate executive thinks that way. I can see the logic for a stockholder not to be disturbed by this bizarre notion that democracy doesn't apply where you spend most of your life. But for working people, what kind of an idea is that? So this is only the modest proposal that we finally bring democracy where it should have been all along, at the workplace. And guess what? Here's a thought. Maybe one of the reasons Americans don't take seriously the political democracy that they have is because they're not used to it. They don't have that opportunity at the job. The job trains them to be an order taker, not an order maker. And here's an even better thought. Maybe if people became used to having real control on the job, they'd be a lot less willing to cede that to crummy politicians in the neighborhood either. Instead of bemoaning the fact that half of our people don't vote, maybe the problem is, again, an economic system that systematically trains you never to participate in or even to think about participating in the decisive decisions of your environment. Have I given you some reasons to think this might be a better way to organize a society? Come on. Come on. You know I have. And I only have done that, and I've only done that because I've used the materials that are familiar to you. If I didn't, I wouldn't have your attention, even to the extent that I do. I often end with a parable, and I'm going to do that this time too. Once upon a time, it was thought that the only way to organize politics was to have the decision-making in the position of one key individual. We called him or her king or queen or czar or emperor or Kaiser. We're rich in a vocabulary for these jerks. And we thought we needed them. We did. We thought if we didn't have someone to lead us, the society would fall apart, chaos would descend, everything would collapse. And then, as has happened so often, and which is going to happen, I think, next month again, we were saved by the French. In 1789, they took several of these kings and they separated their heads from the rest of their bodies. You know, at the end of George Carlin's wonderful performances, he often said, after he made his critique of religion, that if anyone here is offended, let me show you how committed I am. There is no God, and if there is one, I want him to come down and strike the audience dead. And then when the audience laughed, he said, oh, I made a slip. He repeated it and said, strike me dead. And when nothing happened, he said, see, I told you. And the French, when they cut off the heads of Louis, whatever number he had, his number was up. He was finished, and France did not disappear, and chaos didn't reign. We even made a virtue out of killing kings. We celebrated. We wouldn't have one here, we said. Likewise, oh, by the way, the reference to the French, I can see from some of your friends. There's going to be a race for president, an election for president of France next month, in April. All the polls in France indicate, all the polls, that the next president of France will not be Nicolas Sarkozy, who will be defeated. And he will be defeated by the head of the French Socialist Party, Monsieur Hollande. Only in France would you have the leader of the country named after another country. Very complicated. And even more interesting is the unified party of the left, which is much to the left of Mr. Sarkozy, a party which wants to let you know what its position is, so it's called the Left Front, Front de Gauche in French. just went higher in the polls than the right-wing fascist party of Marie Le Pen. So that's also a big moment in French society of a movement to the left. And in case you're wondering, 2 weeks ago at a press conference, Mr. Hollande, François Hollande, stunned all of France by answering a reporter's question as to what he would do differently from Mr. Sarkozy, and he said, remember what I said to you about the Great Depression and Mr. Roosevelt? He said, austerity is a disaster. The first thing I will do after I'm elected is raise the income tax rate on the richest French people from the current 40% to 75%. His polls went up in the week after he made that comment, and he is now scheduled to win this election and perhaps have to make a government together with the Front de Gauche to run that society. And that will be the first break of a major European country from the austerity that has been running from Ireland to Greece to Spain to Italy and all the rest. Very important. The French, you know, amazing people. Wonderful food and killing off right-wing craziness. The second and final parable. Once upon a time, it was thought that when young people get to be the age when they get interested in sex, and it's time to have a mate, the way that has to be arranged is by the parents. Your parents have to go find a suitable mate for you by consulting and negotiating with the other parents of such a mate. The idea that you yourself would go around sampling was thought unbelievable. You're too young, you have no experience, you don't know what life is about, your hormones are out of control, you with them. Can't be done. Well, most of you would not allow, I hope, your parents to make this decision for you, and the world has not disintegrated as a result. Point. If the enterprises of this world were run by the workers in them, it would have no more of the disastrous consequences that occurred to you as I was talking than were the consequences of getting rid of the king or not letting your parents decide who you're going to marry. It takes an act of will to understand things could be different. And we've been brought to this understanding by a system that has been out of control, irrational, wasteful, but has erected around itself an unspeakable taboo in which you can't discuss it, you can't see it. It even has, as Anthony said at the beginning, quoting Marx, its high priests and priestesses, of which a few are in the room, the professional economists, who teach us all to think of capitalism as literally the opposite. A place of equilibrium. This instability is described with the concept of equilibrium. We teach in economics classes that we have an automatic tendency to go to equilibrium. Then we teach that it is, you ready? Efficient. And then finally, you're not going to believe this, stable. If you believe this, you've missed the world in which you live. Economics, as I promised at the beginning, is not all that complicated. If what I've said to you is understandable, I'm here to tell you that's all economics has to contribute. And I can prove it because I actually have a PhD in economics. And as all Americans know, if you have a PhD, you must have been sitting on your ass a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. I'm going to ask you just a couple of quick questions of Rick, and then throw it out to the audience. Just very quickly, I'll take the opportunity, though, to plug two books that I was thinking of as you were speaking. They're both by Irving Bernstein, who's a very interesting historian who wrote about the period that you were writing about of labor upheaval and economic crisis in the 20s and 30s. And Haymarket Books has just put out new editions of these books with introductions by Francis Fox Piven. they're called the lean years and the turbulent years, and I can't recommend them highly enough for people who want to delve more deeply into that period of struggle and crisis that Rick was talking about. Rick, one of the things that is refreshing about you, besides your ability to speak English and your sense of humor, is that there's a lot of people in the field of analysis and certainly in the field of academia today who valorize their own individual contribution to intellectual thought, even though it may be very minimal or negligent. But in your case, you always foreground in a way that I've always really appreciated, that you work within a framework, within a tradition, within a school of thought, and you always foreground that you're a Marxist economist, that you were schooled in Marxist economic thinking. I'd like you to talk about that. Like, what does that mean for you? How did that come about? Why, especially for someone who went to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, which is not where you normally encounter Marxist economists, how that came about?
I have to stand up since I've been teaching for so many years, and I always stood up when I was teaching. To sit down now would mean I'd lose my voice or something, so I'm going to have to do it. I do regret that Anthony listed my academic pedigree, but it does allow me to say something to you. I did go to those schools, I admit it. I was the child of immigrants, and if you're the child of immigrants into the country, you kind of have to make good. The kind of wreckage of my mother and father's life meant that I, as the firstborn here in the new country, had to kind of succeed and make up for what they were frustrated in because they had to leave. My father was French and my mother German, and they had to leave those countries and come here because of the war. So I had to make it. I had to go to all the right schools. I had to do all the right things. And being a very good boy, I did all that. At no point in my education at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale was I ever required to read one word of Karl Marx, just so you understand. Elite, whatever you want to call it, no one ever assigned it. It was true that on a few occasions a professor used a quarter or a half of a lecture to explain to us why there was no need to do any of those things, why that was a silly idea or a dangerous idea or something a little bit confusing, silly and dangerous at the same time. So I had to learn all of this on my own. I had to go find individuals who would teach me, other students who would read it together with me, and we did that. I mean, there were enough of us who found each other because of these shared interests and did it. But this system was not willing to allow me to have any sustained information. There's one exception. I realize I should make one exception. When I graduated from Harvard as an undergraduate, I looked around for somebody who could teach me this, and I was told there are no such people. Until I found out there was one at Stanford, which is the only reason I went to that awful place. And his name was Paul Baran. Some of you have heard of him, B-A-R-A-N, a very famous American, actually a Russian, but he came to the United States also fleeing the war. And he got a job through an enormous mistake. They didn't understand who he was. Like many of the refugees, for those of you not familiar with it, he worked for the government, for something called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner in the United States of the CIA. That became the CIA, but it was during the war. And we're all leftists, we're anti-fascists, and so they worked with the American government against fascism. And people like Galbraith, Paul Sweezy, there were a lot of them who did this as an act of solidarity. And Paul Baran was a professor at Stanford, which is why I went there. Otherwise, I would never have gone there. Unfortunately, he died a few months after I got there, so I left there as fast as I could go. But I made a terrible mistake. I went to Yale. And the reason I went to Yale was once you get into these systems, you're pretty much stuck in them. That is, they think the world of one another, and so they reward one another with staying in there, assuming that you would never want to go anywhere else if you could go to one of those places. So I got caught up in this, not understanding what I was getting into. But no Marxism was taught there. None, none, none. Not in the economics department, and not much anywhere else either. These were the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the taboo that I talked about before was much too strong. We had to do that on our own. But, you know, if something is taboo, it also becomes attractive. It becomes something you're wondering why they're so scared of that. What might be the interesting thing? And that was a factor in many of our minds as well. And in the end, I think it was a combination of looking at this society, realizing that there were terrible things wrong with it, whether that was in race relations or its politics or the war in Vietnam, which was a cathartic event for me and my generation. We found our way to Marxism because we knew there had to be some other explanation for why these things were happening than the silly stuff we were hearing in the newspapers and that our teachers were telling us. We really found our way to Marxism as a way of thinking systematically and critically. That's what we want. We didn't want piecemeal criticism, not this little outrage. No, we wanted something that would give us a systematic way of thinking. And Marxism does that. That's not to say that there aren't problems with it and lapses in it. There are areas where it's blind. All of that's true. But it's a very powerful system. And maybe the best way to answer what Anthony is saying is this the way it made sense to us at the end. If you wanted to understand a family, lived down the street from you, mother, father, let's say, and a couple of kids, and you happen to know that one of the children thought that this was the greatest family. She felt so lucky that she was in this, wonderful mommy and daddy. And the other kid thought they had landed in the greatest dysfunctional disaster ever made. If you wanted to understand the family, would you talk to only one of the children? Or would it make more sense for you to talk to each of the children and then form your own judgment about what you thought? I used to say to myself, why aren't they teaching us a critical approach to capitalism alongside a celebratory approach and let us see as young people what's going on? What's the problem here? And the conclusion I drew is they're afraid. And I have had nothing to change my mind in 50 years to that effect. They're afraid. And like primitive people, when you're afraid, you need to pretend it isn't there. It just isn't there. Then you feel much better. It's just not there. And so when finally the system breaks down and people begin to say, hey, it is there. On the one hand, you have a hard job. I am a Marxist, by the way, in case any of you are wondering. I kind of hope you haven't been wondering much after my talk, but of course I'm a Marxist. That is, I am heavily influenced by that tradition. And I am only more so now than I was 5 years ago, and I was pretty well convinced then. So I'm not apologizing for it. What's the point? I'm glad that I learned what we call neoclassical and Keynesian economics, the dominant schools, but I'm even more glad that I learned a critical school, and I can draw on these and learn from them and put them together in interesting ways. But you're not going to frighten me out of being interested in a critical perspective. Shame on those of you, of course not in this audience, but elsewhere, who would have been part or parcel of a program to exclude a critical perspective. Marxism begins in the mind of an exile called Karl Marx, can't live in his home country of Germany, has been exiled from 4 countries, lands in London, lives most of his adult life in London, writes books, gives speeches. Here we are, only 125 years after he dies, and Marxist movements, trade unions, political parties, intellectual groups exist and prosper in every country on the face of this earth. You ever wanted evidence that there's an idea or a set of ideas that strikes a chord in people? There's it. If those of us in America can't face it, this is not a problem for the rest of the world. And increasingly, it's not a problem here either. I cannot, just to be personal about it, I cannot do the public speaking I'm invited to do. I can't do the radio and television appearances I'm invited to do. There are too many of them. So if anyone tells you in America today, 5 years ago was very different. Everything has changed. But now it's not that a left-wing or even a Marxist perspective can't move forward because the society is unwilling. We could say that for a long time. We can't say that anymore. In America today, it's up to us. The opportunity is here. The question is whether the left in America is ready to realize what's going on and to make the long-awaited move to say, we're here, we feel this way, come join us. The first group to do that, pretty clearly, was the Occupy Wall Street. And in 3 months, they were able to get most polls across America to say that a majority of Americans sympathized with their objectives. That's only possible because the basis for that had been built in the previous 30 years. It's up to us.
Rick, I'd like you to talk about something, actually, it's in the newspapers today. It's not so much the specifics of this particular story, although it's about this World Bank nominee that Obama's put forward, and he's come under a lot of flack. And I just want to quote from the Financial Times this morning. They claim that this guy, Jim Yong Kim, who's the U.S. nominee currently to run the World Bank, maybe we can discuss the merits of that or not, but it's more his views that are of interest. Apparently he was caught quoting Noam Chomsky, which of course you can't do. But then also, this is I'll just read briefly from the FT. Dr. Kim's book contains several inflammatory lines. For example, the introduction, this is a book called Dying for Growth that was put out in 2000, quite a long time ago, I think by Common Courage Press, small independent press. For example, in the introduction to the book, co-authored with 2 other academics, he points out, quote, the studies in this book present evidence that the quest for growth in GDP and corporate profits has in fact worsened the lives of millions of women and men. And this is considered inflammatory. I'd like you to talk about how the press continues to cover these economic issues, and also about the kind of the cult of growth, the cult of the profit system that persists despite the failures that you so clearly described.
Sure. Best way I can think of to get this is to do a parallel. Every day, practically, or certainly every 2 or 3 days, in newspapers like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, you will read a story about some country, a major, minor country, in which the words capitalism and socialism arise in some way. And here's what the story will then say. Country X is capitalist, and here's why. It has private ownership of the means of production and uses markets. Whereas this other country is socialist because it has socialized property and planning. Notice, neither one uses the organization of production. I mean, I just spent an entire 45 minutes talking to you about the issue of the organization of production and explaining how it's rooted in Marx's work. And whatever else you think about Marx, no other tradition outside the Marxian tradition has produced anything like the accumulated theoretical and practical experience in fighting against capitalism. Whether you like it or not, that's the name of the tradition. That overwhelms everything. So if you're going to use a term like socialism and capitalism and the difference, you might want to make some reference to this question. Never. Socialism is planning and socialized property. Capitalism is markets and private property. No conversation about it's as if an alternative organization of production is unthinkable, doesn't exist. It's as if no one has ever talked about it. Thousands of people have talked about it. People are talking about it now. The New York Times, the Wall Street, does not deal, it's not there. 2 weeks ago in New York City, some of you I'm sure were there, We had something, I work on this thing called the Left Forum. Once a year, usually in March or April, we have a huge conference in New York City inviting left-wing academics and left-wing activists. Okay, it's in New York City. It takes over an entire university because it's so big. This year we had about 4,800 people come to this event. That's a sizable event. We take the entirety of something called Pace University, which is located across the street from New York City Hall. So it's a very well-known center. We had people from all over the world. We had 442 panels over 3 days, 1,200 speakers. The major newspapers said nothing. What event? What happened? 50 people had a brawl in Brooklyn. That got in the newspaper. But 4,700 at Pace University, leftists in America today, not worth talking about. You all know how Occupy Wall Street was dealt with in the first few weeks before it became an issue. It wasn't there. I think what you see is a long-term pattern in which the media are usually complicit. It's unfair to say that they should be different. I mean, they are what they are, and they are now part of the big business community. But I'm not surprised that the right wing, which is looking for something to get angry at Mr. Obama about, can go and have some graduate student search the writings of whoever is nominated to try to find something and then to represent it as inflammatory. I can assure you that there are literally hundreds, probably thousands of articles in all the economic journals, even the conservative ones, that have raised questions about whether rising GNP is the equivalent of a rising standard of living or rising welfare or rising utility, to use the language that economics likes. This is not a new idea. It's just an opportunity for the newspaper to beat a drum. All of that has to be pushed aside in this country in order to open this space. But again, I want to assert everything that's happening to people like me, and I'm not the only one, indicates that the audiences for this in this country now are greater than they have been in half a century. The kind of reception I'm getting, way better than what I did in the 1960s, and I was active in the 1960s. So don't look back at that as the golden age. It isn't. The golden age is right now, right here. Things are possible now that were not before. Left-wing movements, one last point, left-wing movements in the last 40, 50 years, whether they've been focused on issues of feminism or anti-racism or whatever they were, immigration rights, gay marriage, whatever, were always split, and usually badly, when the left wing within them wanted to link whatever that issue was with larger questions of capitalism and inequality of wealth. They were told this will endanger our movement. It'll mean we can't realize the particular thing we're working on. And I understand those were real concerns, and they fought that out. What's very new is that Occupy Wall Street put that economic you versus us, we and them, in stark economic terms, right in the forefront. Capitalism is everywhere discussable as such. I'm able to entitle my books in ways that were unthinkable. When I wrote that book, the publisher was anxious about the proposed title. To say capitalism hits the fan suggests what capitalism might be compared to. And this was thought to be too daring, and a focus group was set up. And the focus group came back and said, that's a very attractive title. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called that. When I wrote my doctoral dissertation at Yale, I came to my professors and I said, here's my thing. It's called The Economics of Colonialism. And my professors, who liked me, explained to me, just as in Anthony's question, I can't use that. They will not pass my dissertation. They will not give me the PhD. Because the economics of colonialism is a value-laden term. That's a kind of polite way of saying inflammatory. So if you go and look up in Yale in my year, title of my dissertation is Economic Aspects of British Foreign Policy, instead of the economics of colonialism. That's the kind of fights you have to have until you break through this kind of ideological barrier. Good question about the profit. I use the word very loosely, partly because I don't want to get into the difficulty of distinguishing Marx's idea of surplus from the conventional accounting term profit. Capitalists live in a world of profit. For them, what they pay to the workers who produce something and what they pay to their lawyers on retainer are all costs. And they look at them all as money they have to spend, and all they're interested in is what's the revenue, what's left from the revenue I get after I pay all these costs, and they call that profit. That's a very different category, conceptually and theoretically, from what Marx calls surplus. And if I had the time and if you had the interest, I'd love to explain to you what that's about and what it means. The concept of surplus, as Marx develops it, is banned in bourgeois economics. It doesn't exist. My neoclassical colleagues do not believe there is a surplus, or they occasionally use the word, but for a completely different idea. There is no surplus in production. Most of you would actually agree with Marx, even though you're not perhaps comfortable knowing that. Well, I can see from your face. Let me very briefly. When you go ask somebody for a job in a private sector, you have a conversation with that person. Try to remember back the last time you did that, even if it's a long time. And you have a conversation, and you say, okay, I'm going to come do this job. I'll come every Monday at 9 o'clock and stay till 5, or whatever it is. And you discuss your work, and then you get to that thorny question, how much am I going to get paid? And let's suppose you dicker back and forth and you settle on $20 an hour. You know something. You know something. Even in that moment where you agree, you know the following. The only way on earth that employer would ever give you $20 for every hour that you're there is if the following sentence is true. In that hour, you're going to produce more for that employer to sell than $20 worth. The only way you'll get a job is if you produce more for your employer than he pays you. Therefore, the American idea, I'm never going to work for anybody who doesn't pay me what I'm worth, doesn't understand. That's never going to happen. That never has happened. Didn't happen to your Uncle Charlie or your mother or your father, and it is not going to happen to you. And that awful feeling you have when you come home from work that you've been ripped off, you got it. You understand. That's not an aberration, and that's not going to be solved by spending 2 hours at happy hour. Not going to work. That's the system. That's a surplus. And that's the fund that the capitalist uses to take care of all of his needs, including the small part he keeps for himself called the profit. So these things are different. I use them loosely. In all societies, the workers produce surplus. All workers in all societies produce more than they get. The only different, interesting question that Marx was fascinated with, how do different societies organize this? One way to organize this is to have the workers who produce more than they themselves get be the ones to decide what to do with it. That's what Marx liked. That's what I just argued for. That's exactly what I just argued for. The alternatives, you know the names. Slavery. The slave produces everything, gets a part of it back to keep going. The difference is the surplus, which the slave master gets, keeps, and uses as he sees fit. In feudalism, the serf produces more than he gets, and that difference is called the rent collected by the lord, who uses it the way he sees fit. And in capitalism, the worker produces more than he gets as a wage, and the difference is the surplus that the capitalist uses as he sees fit. Marxism is the protest against all systems in which the people who produce the surplus are not the ones who get and dispose of it. It's a fundamental democratic idea. The reason it can't be taught in this country is that if you have a verbal commitment to democracy, you got a real big problem justifying capitalism. And the way to do that is to avoid all concepts of surplus. But if you had a group of workers running their own plant, they would produce a surplus, and they would themselves decide what to do with it. As to Occupy, I am, I'll put it right out there, a deep, committed enthusiast of the Occupy movement. I am overjoyed. It has opened a space in the United States. Half of the reason I get the invitations I do is because of the work done by that movement to change the way Americans think about the world, their attitude towards economics. It's now legitimate to look at the world in terms of 99% versus 1%. That is extraordinary, especially in this country. We all have to take our hats off to them. And I certainly do. It has just changed everything in this country and is stunning for having done that, number one. Number two, I understand irritation, impatience with the way they do or do not formulate program, the way they do or do not organize themselves in some way. I understand that, and part of that I agree with. But I am hesitant to argue for much of the change. What they have been doing has been more successful in a shorter time in changing the political life of this country than anything else I have been involved with in a long time. There's an old American saying I like, if it ain't broke, what are you fixing it for? Sure, we should be critical. Sure, we should do better. But wow, have they made a difference. As to whether or not it's pre-revolutionary, well, you know, you can't tell that until you look back. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know, and I've said this to some of you before, the media, just as they make inflammatory out of these namby-pamby comment that half a dozen people of all political persuasions do every day, it's just that the Financial Times doesn't know about it or doesn't want to. The reality is that I can say things I couldn't before, that it is possible to put forward radical alternatives and have intelligent people think about them and struggle about them. This is an extraordinary time. The media full of the Tea Party, I understand that. But the change at the other end of the political spectrum is at least as powerful, I think much more powerful, and involves many more people. And it is without the resources of rich people to pay for it. This is not the Koch brothers hyping 12 people into looking like 12,000. We don't have that. We have the opposite. We have a conference of 4,500, and the system pretends that it's not there. Nonetheless, we are very successful, and things are changing. Could we be at the beginning of a process of basic change in the United States? Sure, we could. No one in the Soviet Union or out of it would have said in 1985 that there wouldn't be a Soviet Union 5 years later. No one saw it. No one thought it was possible. We sit here now. We can't imagine a United States that isn't what it's been for a long time. Biggest mistake you can ever make. We even teach economics students that you can't extrapolate forward because it happened this way in the past does not guarantee it's going to happen that way in the future. We are seeing things now that are fundamentally challenging this system in a way it hasn't been for 50 years. That is enough. Let's go to work and build this further, and I think the Occupy movement is a great place to do that.